All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we are talking all about the best bets you can make about the Falcons offense this year, whether or not we'll see big improvement from Kyle Pitts, impact from Drake London, if the Falcons have their long-term quarterback, and if the running game and offensive line come together.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalFans.com, RIP, still going strong on Twitter at FalFans, and of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And we thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. Locked On Falcons is free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. Give us a like, hit that bell, and you will get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. So today's episode, we will be talking about the addition of punter Bradley Pinion towards the end of the episode, but the bulk of today's conversation is going to be about what are the best bets you can make about the Falcons offense. And we're kind of borrowing from the positional review series or preview series that we have been doing over the last week or so, looking at some of those big question marks that we had for the season at each position group. At quarterback, it was, do the Falcons have their guy at quarterback? And that involves questions about Mariota, questions about Desmond Ridder. We talked about at the running back position, whether or not Tyler Allgeier can be this breakout guy, and or whether or not Cordarrelle Patterson can have a repeat of his breakout success from 2021. At wide receiver, we talked about Drake London being sort of the number one guy here in Atlanta. We'll talk a little bit more about Bryan Edwards and his contributions. Tight end, we talked about Kyle Pitts' year 2 jump and whether or not Anthony Ferguson will be better utilized this year than Hayden Hurst was a year ago. In the offensive line, our big question was, how much improvement will that unit make? And so we'll kind of parse some of these big questions of the season into sort of subset questions, and we'll go in order of most likely of these bets to come true to least likely bets. So that will be how we sort of format this thing. And I think the most likely bets are going to be the ones centered on the tight end position. I think, there's reasons for optimism where we can see this Falcons offense being a little bit more tight end forward in 2022 than it was in 2021. And, some of that is due to the expectations that Kyle Pitts will have a better sophomore year than he did as a freshman. And I think the ways that he can improve is getting better at the catch point. That will certainly lead to a little bit more success in the red zone. That was an area where he struggled last year. We expect Kyle Pitts to be the leader in targets this year. Last year, he averaged about 6.5 targets per game. This year, I'm expecting that number to go at least to 8 per game. 8 is the cutoff that you can usually use for a high-end number 2 versus a low-end number 1. So we're hoping that Kyle Pitts can be that low-end number 1 at least, if not more than that, this upcoming season. And I think one of the ways that Kyle Pitts can increase his production by getting more of those targets is getting a lot more of the short stuff. Right, a big percentage of Kyle Pitts' targets last year were vertical throws, but only 42% of all his targets last year were throws under 10 or more yards in the air. And you compare that to Hayden Hurst in 2020, that was 59% of his targets were short throws. Austin Hooper in his 2 years in 2018 and 2019 was 64%. And then you compare, Kyle Pitts to Darren Waller, a player that a lot of people compared him to athletically when he came out a year ago. Waller had 56% of his targets in 2019 and 2020 be those shorter throws. And I think if Kyle Pitts does see a significant increase in those sort of quote unquote dink dunk throws, he's got to be better after the catch in those situations. Last year on 27 catches on short throws, he only was able to force 1 tackle one missed tackle, according to Pro Football Focus. So that amounts to about 4% of the opportunities. And you compare that to Hurst in 2020, where it was 9%. Hooper in 18 and 19 was 11%, and Waller in 19 and 20 was 14%. So those guys are creating more after the catch in terms of breaking tackles and avoiding tacklers, 2-3 times as much as Kyle Pitts was, and that will benefit him to be able to take those simple 5-yard throws on like slants and screens and whatever and turn them into 15-yard gains. And we know that Kyle Pitts is, greatest strength is the fact that he is much more of a vertical receiver than those guys that we're talking about. And so that's what makes him this rare unicorn, is that you can get that production on the short stuff potentially. We haven't seen it yet, but we're expecting more of that this year. And also couple that with the rare skill set that he has as a true vertical threat in this offense. And then you look at Anthony Firkser, the other tight end, and we talked about this in the tight end preview, where Firkser and Hayden Hurst in Firkser in 2020 and Hurst in 2021 had a similar workload in terms of how many snaps they were running routes, but Firkser was targeted 50 times on those plays versus Hurst's 31 targets, which is about 50% more per snap. And so I'm expecting Firkser to get match that number of 50 or more targets, assuming he gets a comparable workload as Hayden Hurst, which I assume he will, if not a greater workload than Hayden Hurst. And so I'm currently, and we'll see how this changes as the rest of the summer unfolds as we get closer to the season. But right now I'm kind of projecting Firkser to have, 60, 65, maybe even 70 or more targets this upcoming season. So he should have a golden opportunity to double the production that we saw from Hayden Hurst. So that's one way that the Falcons offense can probably be a little bit more efficient. And then I think the third best bet that you can make of this group is betting on Bryan Edwards being, I guess you could call him a successful reclamation project if you want to sit here and say that, the Raiders gave up on him. We saw flashes from Bryan Edwards in Las Vegas. He just never fully put it together. And one of the ways that he could help fully put it together here in Atlanta is being asked to be less of a vertical threat in the Falcons offense than he was in the Raiders offense. And that was something that Matt Harmon of Yahoo Sports said earlier this week on the podcast, where the Raiders tried to use Bryan Edwards in the similar ways that they use Henry Ruggs and Deshaun Jackson as these vertical threats. And that really wasn't his game in a key way. Edwards, about 29% of his targets in 2021 were on deep throws, 20 plus or more yards. And you compare that to AJ Brown and in 2019 and 2020 under Arthur Smith, who played the X wide receiver position that Edwards played with the Raiders, and will likely get a significant amount of reps there here in Atlanta when Drake London's not filling those shoes. And AJ Brown only had about 15% of his targets in 19 and 20 being on those deep throws. And when you compare AJ Brown and Bryan Edwards, not necessarily in terms of the deep stuff, but on the short and intermediate stuff, their efficiency numbers are very comparable, right? In terms of looking at catch rate, looking at yards per attempt. Now, AJ Brown was much better after the catch, but Bryan Edwards was a little bit more sure-handed, with far less drops than AJ Brown did. So I think Bryan Edwards is sort of tailor-made to be this sort of possession X wide receiver, and that should lead to him having a more successful year in 2021 with the Falcons than we have seen him have with the Raiders in previous years. 2022 with the Falcons. So those are the best bets that you can make. We'll talk about some other bets as we continue today's episode, talking about that maybe they're not as good a bet. They still have a decent possibility of coming true. That will include the conversation surrounding Drake London and his ability to impact instantly, as well as the improvements made by the offensive line potentially this season. And we'll get into all of that as we continue today's episode. But, speaking of making good bets, if you have some good bets that you want to make, head on over to the number one source for all your sports betting needs and info. And of course, I'm talking about betonline.net. And whether you want to bet on Wimbledon, Major League Baseball, boxing, UFC, esports, Vegas casino games, you want to bet on NFL prop bets, future bets, Falcons win total over under, you want to bet on Marcus Mariota comeback player of the year, Drake London offensive rookie of the year, you want to bet on who's going to go to the finals in the NBA next year, who's going to win the Stanley Cup next year, who's going to be the MVP in any of one of these leagues, you can find it all at BetOnline. So head on over to the website at betonline.net to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline is where the game starts. So, our next set of bets are, I would term them possible, right? The previous three, I would sit here and say they're likely. to come true. These are possible. These are more of a coin flip type of bets that we're talking about. And the first one we'll talk about is the other wide receiver beyond Bryan Edwards is Drake London. And the question about Drake London is he going to be an instant impact wide receiver? And the reason why you're willing to make this bet is because Drake London should have a lot of opportunities. He's probably the best bet among this rookie receiver class to basically lead his team in receiving this year. And you look back over the last 20-ish years, going back to 2000, 48 rookies have had over 100 targets in their first year in the NFL. 17 of those have come in just 3 seasons out of that 22-year span. That was 2021 this past year. So that included Jamar Chase and Kyle Pitts. And we're talking about receivers, not wide receivers. We're talking about running backs, tight ends, and wide receivers. 2020 was also another year where you saw 5 guys get 100 plus targets. Last year it was 5 as well. And then you had 7 guys in 2014 have 100 plus targets. So 17 out of the 48 came in just 3 years. So that means over the other 19 years in our data set, on average, there was only 1.6 wide receivers per year that had 100 or more targets. And when I look at this year's draft class, I do think Drake London is probably the best bet if it follows that trend of maybe 1 or 2 guys reaching 100 or more targets. I think Drake London is as good a bet as you can make in this draft class, just because while we do kind of expect him to be technically the number 2 to Kyle Pitts this year, he's probably going to be the number 1 among this wide receiver core, unless of course Bryan Edwards winds up, being a little bit more like AJ Brown than we're necessarily projecting him to be. So I think Drake London's going to have an opportunity to put up production this year and be that instant impact guy that can generate explosive plays, be that possession receiver, be a force in the red zone, all those various things. He will have the opportunities. It's just a question of whether or not, as a rookie, he's going to be able to take advantage of the opportunities, because we know that there aren't that many, successful rookies. We've seen a lot of successful guys in the recent drafts, but you wonder sort of how much of that is just, oh, these are just 2 really good draft classes, because that 2014 draft class that we're talking about earlier was labeled a historic draft class. And then you kind of wonder, 2020 and 2021, were they kind of historic draft classes? And in certain ways, they kind of feel like they were. And I don't know if this 2022 draft class was, that was one of the arguments against, that I made prior to the draft of why I didn't necessarily love the idea of the Falcons drafting a wide receiver. So we'll see if Drake London is able to take advantage of it. Again, he has an opportunity. It's just going to be a question of whether he takes advantage of it. Moving on to the offensive line, and these sort of, again, coin flip type of bets, our quote unquote bad trio of blockers, and Jalen Mayfield, Matt Hennessy, and Caleb McGarry going to be better is one of these bets that we're going to make. And one of the things we talked about on yesterday's episode, breaking down the offensive line, are the glimmers of hope that if you're going to bet on this, you're betting on this, you're betting on Dwayne Ledford doing a better job coaching up these guys than previous, incarnations of Falcons offensive line coaches. You're betting on, the fact that Jalen Mayfield progressed over the course of the season, and that will continue into this season. You're betting on the fact that Matt Hennessy and Caleb McGarry are sort of entering the prime years for offensive linemen for the click for these guys, right? Yes, year 3, that's year 4. PFF has a lot of data that backs up that basically say those are the years that offensive linemen typically, put it all together and make their big jumps. We saw that with Chris Lindstrom making a big jump last year in year 3. We didn't quite see that with Jake Matthews, because his jump didn't really happen until year 5, which is part of the reason why you hear me throw Chris Morgan, the Falcons' former offensive line coach, under the bus, because basically Jake Matthews developed at a much slower rate under his watch than you typically expect to see. We didn't see that jump for Jake until, a year or 2 after it should have happened. And so that's one of the reasons why we're hopeful that Dwayne Ledford is, every bit as good a coach as he is reputed to be. And we talked about how Caleb McGarry showed progress last year when he went against the guys that gave him the most fits in previous years, which was the NFC South guys like Brian Burns, Cam Jordan, Shaq Barrett, and jokingly saying that those guys had a group chat in 2019 and 2020 making fun of Caleb McGarry, and that group chat was relatively quiet last year. And so if you see that type of progress against, arguably some of the better pass rushers that he's faced, there should be indication that will sort of solidify and click this upcoming season. And, you don't necessarily have that sort of overwhelming evidence of Matt Hennessy, but probably the one thing that you could probably cherry pick is, like, in that week 2 game against Vita Vea in Tampa Bay. He really struggled in that game. And then in the rematch against Tampa Bay, didn't struggle nearly to the same degree in that game. So that may be a sign of progress that Matt Hennessy's slowly starting to figure it out and can build off of that. So I think that's a decent bet that these three guys can be better. The other bet that you could also make that also has a 50-50 chance that we talked about quite a bit on yesterday's episode is whether or not we could potentially replace these guys with, up to 3 new starters at left guard, center, and right tackle. And those guys would be upgrades at the position. And so, we talked about Jermaine Ifedi and how Jermaine Ifedi in the last 2 years as the Chicago Bears starting right tackle was a league average pass protector, which was better than what Caleb McGarry has been over that period of time. We talked about how Drew Dahlman in a limited sample size last year, I affectionately called him a dirtbag, similar to Joe Hawley, which was a guy that you can argue we saw in 2 games late last year where he rotated with Matt Hennessy in one of those games, not the Tampa Bay game. That was the game that Hennessy showed progress in. But in the Jacksonville game, Dahlman was better. So, that gives you, again, talking 50-50, that's a 50-50 proposition that if Dahlman gets extended reps, he'll be better than Matt Hennessy. And then, we talk about Jalen Mayfield being better in December. If you look at all the guards in the NFL that had at least 200 snaps over those last 6 or so games of the season in December and January, even though Mayfield was better than he was earlier in the season, he was still 61st out of 66 guards ranked according to his PFF grades. And so you compare that to other players last year. Justin McCray, formerly of the Falcons, playing with the Texans last year, was 55th. Daniel Brunskill, formerly of the Falcons, playing with the 49ers, was 46. And so essentially what we're talking about is basically being better than what Jalen Mayfield was even at his best, relative best last year in the month of December, is still basically being a replacement level player. That's what Justin McCray certainly is and was. And so you kind of look at the other options at left guard in Justin Schaefer and Jonathan Harrison and Kobe Gosson and Elijah Wilkinson, and you sit here and you say, like, can't we get replacement level play from any number of these guys? Can any one of these guys be just as good as Justin McCray or better? And that would be an upgrade over Jalen Mayfield if he's only as good as he was in December last year. So, that's one of the reasons why you sit here and you go, like, that's a decent bet. Again, you don't know that because we don't have a large enough sample size from guys like Schaefer and Harrison and Gossett and Wilkinson to really feel like that's a good bet that you can make. But based off of very limited sample size, a game here, a game there, Gossett graded out as a 58 in the week 18 game against the Saints when he replaced Jalen Mayfield, while Jalen Mayfield's grade in the month of December was 48. Again, that's an indicator that he's better than Mayfield, a potential upgrade. But, one game is not necessarily something that you want to make a huge bet on. It could be an outlier or whatever the case may be. That's the difference between betting on Ifedi, because we have 14 games, 14 starts at right tackle over the last 2 years that we can realistically think is a relatively good bet in that regard. So, I think you can flip a coin saying, regardless whether you want to bet on the 3 guys that are going to, keep their jobs or 3 new guys, that there will be improvement this year. Obviously, the big question is just going to be how much improvement, 50 going from the 61st best left guard in the league, to the 55th best guard in the league, is not a massive improvement, but it is an improvement. And, we're talking about continuity. And basically on yesterday's episode, talking about possibly replacing these guys with 3 new starters, I said continuity be damned. But there's clear evidence, despite that sort of spicy take, that there's clear evidence that continuity is a good thing when it comes to the offensive line and has been critical to the Falcons' overall team success in recent years. When you look at sort of how often they're changing up their 5-man unit, it's less of a issue of continuity from year to year, but a continuity within a year. And one of the things I've tracked over the years is how many different starting lineups that the Falcons have had, because you notice this trend where you're constantly shuffling in a new set of 5 different guys starting on your offensive line leads to poor success. When you have that sort of stability, you have a lot more success. And I have a graphic. So another reason to go check out Locked On Falcons on YouTube. But here's a graph going back to 1996, so 26 seasons of the Falcons starting lineup in each game. And here's a graph that shows, at the bottom row, if you're looking at the graph, it shows the number of different 5-man units that they had over the course of a season. And then it's, looking at the average wins that they had in that given season. And in the years where the Falcons only had this, one starting unit, the same starting five started every single game, they averaged 12.7 wins in those years, right? Those 3 years happened to be 1998, 2016, and 2010. So years where the Falcons went, coincidentally, I don't think it's a coincidence. The Falcons went to the Super Bowl and were a 1 seed. They averaged 12.7 wins. When they've had 2 units, their average win total was 12 wins. In those 2 years that make up that data set was 2008 and 2012. So arguably the other 2 best years that the Falcons have had in the last 25 or 26 years. 3 units, you see a big drop off, and the average win total was 8.1 wins. 4 units was, the number of lineups is 7.2 wins. 5 was 6 wins. 6 units was 5.3 wins. So you see this strong correlation between how often you're shuffling in new offensive linemen to team success. And last year we saw 3 different units. Now granted, we had the same unit starting 15 games and one other unit starting one other game each last year, so we had relative continuity given that the majority of games, but overall we still had 3 units, so it meshed 7 wins on average, 8 wins over the course of the season. So the reason why we bring this up is because part of the key to the Falcons offensive line being better is we talk a lot about the 3 starters that the Falcons may or may not have to reshuffle, but we know there's 2 guys on this offensive line that are very good. And that's Jake Matthews and Chris Lindstrom. And one of the other keys to success is those guys being healthy throughout the entire year. You don't want to have those guys shuffling in and out of the lineup, because those are the 2 sort of foundational stabilizing pieces on your offensive line. And if you're going to have any success on the offensive line, you already have the question marks at the other 3 spots. You don't want to have question marks at those 2 spots. And it's notable because whether you look at, the last 5 years, the last 10 years, the last 25 years, on average, the Falcons have had the same starting 5 in each year start about 10 games per year. The most popular starting 5 started about 10 games. So what that means is, there's about 6 games on average each year where your depth on the offensive line comes into play because somebody new or different is going to be starting one of those games. And so, you look at the left tackle position, their top backup is Rick Leonard. Their top backup at the right guard position, presumably, is Kobe Gossett, at least based off of who was getting the majority of the second team reps in OTAs. And so we're imagining a scenario, if this is an average NFL season, we'll see, whatever that starting lineup is going to be this season with the Falcons starting 5, they'll start 10 games. And there's going to be 6 games where we could potentially have a Rick Leonard starting, at left tackle. We could have, Kobe Gossett starting at right guard, or whatever the case may be. And if that's the case, given all the other concerns you have on your offensive line, that's not a great recipe for success for this offensive line to show significant improvement. Now, the good thing, and the reason why this is a pretty good bet, is because Jake Matthews and Chris Lindstrom have been very durable in recent years. Jake Matthews hasn't missed a start since his rookie season. Right? He's gone 127 straight games starting at left tackle for the Falcons. That is the most since I've tracked since the mid-90s. Bob Whitfield had 91 consecutive starts. I think Tyson Clabo had 91 at right tackle for him. So Jake Matthews is already one of the most durable players that we've had in recent years, over the last 2-3 decades. The highest consecutive win start streak was set by Todd McClure from 2002 to 2010, and that was 144. So if Jake Matthews starts every single game this year, he'll match Todd McClure's sort of Ironman record. And so you sit there and you say, if he can maintain that's a potential plus for the Falcons, but obviously injuries are random and freakish. And so you feel like, okay, well, he's been healthy for 7-ish years, why not 8? But you can't necessarily be like, oh, that's definitely, if you believe in law of averages or whatever the case may be, and if you're a Falcons fan, you certainly believe in Murphy's law, then you do wonder about that, if that's a great bet, if that streak gets broken in year 8 or whatever the case may be. With Chris Lindstrom, he has started 37 consecutive games since his rookie season, which among right guards going back over the last couple of decades is the 3rd most. Gene Williams had 38. Keenan Forney had 56 consecutive starts. And so Lindstrom, if he starts every game this year, will firmly move into second place among the right guard position. And then you could continually build off of that because you look at the other the left guard position, and Justin Blaylock had a streak of 102 starts over 8 seasons at the left guard position. So there's still a lot of room for Lindstrom to sort of show that durability moving forward. So again, injuries are hard things to bet on or against. They're relatively rare, but you also sort of wonder a little bit about that we know injuries typically do happen along the offensive line, going back to that point about 10 versus 6 games. So we'll see if Lindstrom and Matthews can maintain their Iron Man streaks and their durability and whatnot. I think it's a pretty good bet to make, but it's going to be necessary for this offensive line to improve to the level that we kind of hope it's going to need. So we will close out today's episode talking about the bets that are not necessarily good bets. The bets are less likely to come true for the Falcons, and that will focus on the running back positions and the quarterback positions. And we'll also talk about, Bradley Pinion, the Falcons' new punter, to close out today's episode. And we'll get into all of that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast. So, guys, we're talking about the less likely bets that you don't want to necessarily be putting a ton of money on. Like, let's say, the tight end bets and the Bryan Edwards bet, you'll put $100 on. The offensive line and the Drake London bet, maybe you put $50. These are like $20 bets. Like they might come true. You might hit big on it, but the odds are not going to necessarily be in your favor to win the bet. But if you do win it, it will be, a nice little payout for you. The first one we'll talk about is the running back position. Is Tyler Allgeier going to be that workhorse that the Falcons need at the position? And, I don't think that's a great bet. Not to sit here and say that Tyler Allgeier won't have a solid rookie year, but I think the Falcons, ideally, their goal in terms of being that workhorse is being a guy that can get 12, 15 carries a game, average 4+ yards per carry, and basically have a comparable season to, I think, what Javonte Williams had last year with the Broncos, where he had about 200 carries and about 900 yards. I think that's sort of what you're hoping for from Tyler Allgeier, which gives you a lot of hope and optimism for future success for him. And I don't know if that's a great bet. I think part of that is owed to the idea that maybe he won't get as many opportunities because the Falcons may not, be as committed to running the football late in games where you expect Tyler Allgeier to get the brunt of his carries and be that grinder, which is what the Falcons were attracted to the guy that could be that grinder and that closer. You expect the Falcons to be more competitive, but that may not necessarily mean that they're running the football in the third and fourth quarters of games. And if they're throwing the football, you don't expect Tyler Allgeier to be sort of their go-to guy. That's going to be Cordarrelle Patterson. And then you wonder about Patterson. Is he going to have the repeat success as he did a year ago? I think it's very likely that Patterson will regress. It's just good to me a question of how much he's going to regress, because when you look at his production as a pass catcher last year, if you use PFF's, yards per route run metric, Patterson's 2.24 was second best in the league last year. But when you compare it over the last 5 years of NFL running backs, it was like the 10th best in that span of time. But out of like 280 running backs that qualify, that's still like 97th percentile. And it doesn't seem likely to bet on a 97th percentile type of career year that Patterson just had. Now, does that mean that, he's going to fall off a cliff or anything like that? No, he may have a worse year, but he's still like 90th percentile or something like that. So it's not to sit here and say that Patterson can't have a good year this year. It's just, he's probably not going to have as good a year as he had a year ago. And some of that may just simply be owed to the fact that the Falcons' weapons around him are going to be a little bit better. And so therefore he won't get as many opportunities as we saw a year ago. So Patterson having a repeat of last year, I think, is not a good bet, but it does not necessarily mean that you betting on Patterson having a good season is a bad bet. Now, let's move on to the quarterback position. And in the two sort of bets that you are potentially making is Desmond Ridder the long-term answer at quarterback, and is Marcus Mariota going to be a successful reclamation project? Let's talk about Desmond Ridder first, right? And we've talked about this before on the podcast. The hit rate of quarterbacks taken in that second, third, fourth round range where we took Ridder is, going back 20 plus years, it's like 10 to 20%, depending on what your parameters are. And when you look at the guys that were successful, at least those early in their careers that were successful, like a Russell Wilson, like a Dak Prescott, there's a strong correlation, if not causation, between them going to teams that check at least two out of the following three boxes, and having a good running game, a good offensive line, and or a good defense. And obviously the Falcons don't necessarily have those things. Now, it doesn't mean that the Falcons are all terrible at those things, but when we're talking about good, we're not talking about, hey, having the 18th best, whatever. We're talking about having a top 5 or a top 10 type of unit. And as optimistic as anybody is, I really don't think anybody thinks it's a good bet that the Falcons will be top 10 or top 5 in any sort of meaningful statistical category this year. So one of the things we talked about before with Desmond Ridder is, like, given those circumstances and given that lack of supporting cast, probably the best case, one of the better case scenarios, and maybe not the best, but one of the better case scenarios for Desmond Ridder to succeed despite that is similar to what Gardner Minshew did in his rookie years in Jacksonville, where he didn't necessarily have that caliber of supporting cast, but still had a productive rookie season. But we saw Gardner Minshew did not prove to be the long-term answer in Jacksonville. And so similar, I think Desmond Ridder, like Gardner Minshew being sort of a bridge to Trevor Lawrence, we could see Desmond Ridder essentially being a bridge quarterback. That's what I would think is probably your best bet when it comes to Desmond Ridder's long-term answer. Now, that could still be a guy that starts 2 or 3 years here in Atlanta, but whether or not he's going to still be the starter, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years down the road is not necessarily a good bet. And it's just, it's not to sit here and say that that makes Desmond Ridder a bust or anything like that. Like, the value of Desmond Ridder is not necessarily being this franchise quarterback. The value of Desmond Ridder is giving the Falcons competent quarterback play, maybe league average quarterback play for extremely cheap. And that allows the Falcons to get, to remain competitive as a football team, but also have, the cap space and the time to build up the rest of their roster so that should Desmond Ridder continue to progress, we can sit here and say, oh, he's got a strong supporting cast around him. And now he is in a position to be successful and potentially be that franchise quarterback, or the next guy that we come in that, instead of a situation like Jacksonville find themselves with Trevor Lawrence and going to, a very bad situation, a cluster fudge, as it were. He's going, that next quarterback is going to a much better situation. And then he can be the Dak Prescott or the Russell Wilson or whomever, the Mac Jones, etc., or Matt Ryan, that goes into a more favorable situation and has success. And so, Desmond Ridder is probably, more the best bet is he's going to be more in that Andy Dalton, Daniel Jones, Teddy Bridgewater tier of quarterback. I think that's a good bet to make, but him being beyond that, I don't know, is a great bet. And you look at someone like the Andy Dalton, who did last like 9 years in Cincinnati, and a lot of that was due to his immediate success in the league. They went to the postseason, his first 5 years in the league, and he inherited a decent running game, a good offensive line, and a top 10 defense. And so it's like, it's not a coincidence there. So moving on to Marcus Mariota, the same issues that are going to plague Desmond Ridder in terms of supporting cast also are probably making it not a great bet to bet on Marcus Mariota being a successful reclamation project. I think, Mariota being able to last more than a season here in Atlanta as this quote unquote bridge quarterback is kind of hinging on him making this Falcon team super competitive this year, and not just like, oh, they'll win like 7 games or something like that. Like, no, they actually win like 9 or 10 games and are either, a tiebreaker away or actually in the playoffs this upcoming season. Because I think next year, when you have an opportunity to cut bait with Mariota and move on, saving $12 million and assuming again the idea that Desmond Ridder can be somewhere close to mid-tier quarterback. If Mariota is only a mid-tier quarterback this year, which I think is actually a pretty good bet to happen, like, why not save $12 million and make a minimal drop off in quarterback and get younger and all that various things, and have the potential for Desmond Ridder to be better than that with development and all those various things. So, I think for Mariota to be a successful reclamation project, you're going to have to see him play like a top 10 quarterback this year. And, given the lack of supporting cast that the Falcons have, which is not going to necessarily put him in a position to do that very easily, that's not a good bet to me. It's not impossible for Mariota to basically play out of his mind this season, but it's not a good bet, right? You look at last year and you look at the one quarterback that didn't have a great supporting cast, that played at a high enough level for his team to actually have a winning record, and that was basically Justin Herbert. Right? He didn't have a running game. He didn't have an offensive line. He didn't have a good defense or whatever the case may be. The running game was okay. It's like not terrible or anything like that. But but he was able to play that level. And Justin Herbert was, top 10, top 5, top 3 quarterback, depending on who you ask last year. And so the idea that Marcus Mariota is going to play at that level this year is just not a good bet. Not impossible. It's a non-zero chance that he can play at that level, but it's, very, very, very low. Because when you look at Marcus Mariota's history, and the one time that he came playing at a level approaching that was in 2016. And I don't think it's a coincidence that that year the Titans had a top 5 running game, and they had arguably a top 5 offensive line as well. So they kind of check 2 of those 3 boxes. So again, it doesn't mean that Mariota is going to suck this year. Again, I think if you're betting on him being close to league average quarterback, basically having a comparable season to what Matt Ryan had, which was basically a league average quarterback, I think that's actually a pretty decent bet that you can make. That would be one of those 50-50, if not better bets that you can make, but that's not going to be a guy that the Falcons are going to hang on to for more than a year. That will do it for our best bets segment of today. So in descending order, put your bets on tight ends, the wide receivers, then the offensive line, and then, running backs, and then probably the quarterbacks in terms of those guys having the sort of the big years and the big production that we're all hoping for. So, talking about big years and big production, the Falcons got a punter, man. And all of a sudden, their outcomes change. Maybe I should reassess these best bets, but based off of the fact that the Falcons special teams is back, baby. If you don't know, they signed veteran punter Bradley Pinion, formerly of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, on Thursday. They cut Dom Maggio, who happened to be the first official signing of the Terry Fontenot era. Unfortunately, that era is now over, at least the Dom Maggio era. The Terry Fontenot era hopefully will be going on much stronger, and that will not be an indicator of, things to come with Terry Fontenot. But we're being positive on Locked On Falcons. So it's easy to be positive when the Falcons get a veteran punter like Bradley Pinion, who's very productive for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers the last 3 years. Prior to that was productive for the 49ers, but it seems like these teams he's not good enough to get paid, one of these top end veteran punting contracts. This is why teams keep moving on. The Bucs drafted Jake Camarda of, the national champion University of Georgia this past year, and the writing was on the wall for Pinion and Sterling Hofrichter, who is the other punter that they had on the roster. I was hoping that they would cut Hofrichter and we could sort of scoop him back up and redo that, quote unquote mistake of moving on for him. Obviously he was injured and all that, so we won't get into all that stuff on today's episode. But the thing about Pinion is that he's a veteran punter. We saw last year when the Falcons tried to go young with Maggio and Cam Nislak, it didn't work out. They got better when they brought in Dustin Colquitt, and then things got even better when they brought in Thomas Morstead. It was unfortunate that the Falcons didn't re-sign Thomas Morstead. We won't get into the reasons why, but I imagine it has to do with age. Morstead was 35. Pinion's only going to be 28 this year. So realistically, if he does have a solid year and continues to be a solid punter, it's less likely that the Falcons will let him walk in free agency next year. They'll be probably a little bit more willing to pay him, particularly after they get a windfall in cap space next year as well. So, this is a solid pickup for the Falcons. It seemed inevitable to me that, I didn't really buy into the idea that Dom Maggio or Seth Vernon would be the Falcons. Either one of those guys would be the Falcons punter come week 1. But now that's sort of seemingly official, assuming nothing crazy happens with Bradley Pinion or anything like that this summer. So he should be the starting punter for the Falcons week 1. So hopefully that will mean that the Falcons special team is back on track with the kicker in Younghoe Koo, with the punter and Bradley Pinion. He is pinning Yun. Okay, no, I'm sorry. Sorry, I was trying to use a pun on his last name, but I won't. And now it's just the one question on, the Highlander, aka Liam McCullough, the long snapper, and whether or not he can successfully replace Josh Harris. So if we can solidify that long snapper spot, the Falcon special teams will be back to being the most valuable unit, the MVU or the MVP, most valuable phase. I'm so clever off the top of my head, guys. The MVP of the Falcons this year. So that is a great bet to make if you're betting on solid long snapper play, which how bad can it be? Famous last words or whatever the case is. So we should be good. We should be good. Hopefully, we'll see. So that will do it, guys. Tomorrow, that's it for the week. But next week, we will have our guest, a special guest, Alan Stirk, formerly of the Locked On Falcons podcast, currently of the Falcoholic, to join me on Falcons all-time draft series, where we'll be having a dueling fantasy style snake draft, picking the best players from Falcons history on both offense and defense. Unfortunately, we won't be doing special teams, but we'll sort of have a dueling, team to build up the best roster we possibly can. And you, the listeners, you, the viewers, will be able to vote next week to say who sort of won the draft, who picked the better team, all that stuff and more. So look forward to that. That will be running a 4-part series all week long. And then I think on Friday, we'll probably do a Q&A in all likelihood. So if you have a lingering question, I know some of you guys have sent in questions over the last couple of weeks that I haven't gotten a chance to answer. We'll get to those next Friday. And if you have any questions that you want to send in, of course, you can do so via Twitter at Locked On Falcons, via Facebook at Locked On Falcons. You can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel, guys. So I appreciate you for tuning in for another week of, great Locked On Falcons content. And we'll be back with more great content in next week. I hope you guys have a great, for the 95% of you that are, living stateside, I hope you have a great 4th of July weekend and holiday. Get some hot dogs, don't let the fireworks, bother you too much. It's crazy how, like, when you're a kid, fireworks are the greatest thing in the world, but the older you get, the less fun they are. It's like, okay, guys, like, we'll stop it. But that's, that's a hill I'll die on somewhere else. I'll leave that negativity for fireworks. There's a time and place for fireworks, but at 12 a.m. or whatever the case may be, like, can we stop, guys? Can we stop? Some people got to sleep. But that's just the old man in me. So, whether you're old, young, whatever, I hope you have a great weekend. Appreciate it, guys. Till then.